So Robin is an old timer here. He's one of the few people that we've invited twice because of his ongoing research activities and the interest of his work, I think, to people here at the Grad Center. I was trying to remember exactly. It was something about social movements the last time.
Civil disobedience.
Yeah, civil disobedience and social movements. Has that come out as an article?
Yes, a couple of papers. Yeah.
Right. But I mention that because I sort of feel intellectual camaraderie. We've sort of worked on similar themes over the years, and I see you're now focusing on critical social theory as an explicit issue with regard to questions of that are pressing questions today for democratic theory and just for all of us as people concerning structural injustices, xenophobia, and racism.
And for introducing me so generously. Really nice to be back here at the colloquium at the Center for Global Ethics and Politics, and to see also some familiar faces again, and that's really nice. Well, this is kind of work in progress. It's on the one hand an article that I'm revising currently, but also part of a bigger book project, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion and any feedback you might have. So yeah, the concept of structural racism has become increasingly central to a lot of political and ideological conflicts in our time. It's to many, including fringe figures, but not only, also mainstream journalists and powerful politicians, not much more than an ideological weapon that they say undermines the open and liberal society we presumably live in, and that has to be now protected by initiatives like the Stop Woke Act that Ron DeSantis signed into law in Florida in 2022. When DeSantis' general counsel was asked what that term woke in the Stop Woke Act actually refers to, he said it's the belief that there are systemic injustices in American society and that we need to address them. So it's this belief that is seen as the problem rather than anything that could be designated by that label. Similar claims can be found all around, including in the German context, where the concept of structural racism has been associated with North Korean-style ideology, and where a major political think tank, the think tank associated with the Conservative Party, claims that it's part of an ideological attack in the name of identity politics. Now, against this background, in this presentation, I will first reconstruct some of the epistemic obstacles to talking about structural racism, especially in the German case, but some of that will probably generalize to other contexts, and especially focus on the difficulties of moving the debate beyond a focus on prejudice and xenophobia, which is the kind of dominant frame.
Recording in progress.
And I then argue that these obstacles have in part also shaped how racism was thematized, if it was thematized at all, in the Frankfurt School, critical theory, which I would argue is both surprising in some ways and not so surprising in other ways. Subsequently, I will sketch the broad outlines of an account of the structural nature of racism that is informed by earlier work in that same tradition, as well as by contemporary social theoretical approaches. I take this to be an important contribution that critical theory in the Frankfurt School tradition can make, because at least in some strands of the public debate and some strands of the philosophical debate, the exact meaning and role of the structural racism is left quite vague. And then finally, I will illustrate the diagnostic usefulness and critical force of such an account by discussing a recent example of the kind of contested thematization of racist violence in the German context, and will hopefully show why this kind of approach is going to be helpful in this respect. So if you sift through now I'm talking more about the public discourse that is problematizing the notion of structural racism, but this also finds some echoes in more academic approaches. There seem to be three main complaints against that notion. The first kind of epistemological complaint is that structural racism stretches the concept of racism beyond recognition, or to be more precise, beyond what can be empirically observed or measured. So it's argued that since traditionally racism was understood in terms of kind of explicit racist beliefs or discrete acts of racist violence, those are observable, those are measurable. Once you move beyond those and to the seemingly more latent structural features of racism, it's just unclear how that can be objectively assessed, measured, and so on. So that's one complaint. The second one is a more moral complaint. Argument is that structural racism is morally problematic because it kind of trivializes the real racism of individual acts of racist violence. And so just to talk vaguely about racism as a structural phenomenon or a systemic phenomenon kind of lets real racists off the hook almost, because, well, we're all somehow entangled in this. And so what's the difference between some racist thug and others who, just sort of go through the life without engaging in direct racist acts or without voicing direct racist beliefs. And a third, there's a political complaint, namely that talking of structural racism is counterproductive because it risks alienating the supposedly non-racist majority by again suggesting that somehow we're all implicated in that. People then read this as saying that they are racist and then react against that by denying it and not wanting to talk about it, etc. And obviously this is how also in the US context, critical race theory is sometimes portrayed, that it suggests that, well, everyone, including little school children, are racist in that sense and have to be kind of addressed as such. Now, theorists of structural racism have, of course, provided answers to these complaints, but they seem to be, let's say, still circulating. And I think one reason why they can have a certain air of plausibility is that because in the more popular discourse on racism, it is indeed often left under-theorized or under-explained what structural racism actually exactly designates. The term is often used in a register of kind of moral obviousness rather than analytical clarity and social theoretical elaboration. So those are some of the reasons why I think it's worth continuing the work that many people have already engaged in clarifying what the structure actually refers to here, in order to also counter that kind of public backlash that we see. Now, turning to the specifically German context, there are further and deeper, historically deeper reasons, I think, for why the term structural racism meets so much resistance, reasons that also have to do with the way in which the term racism itself has had, let's say, a hard time in post-1945 Germany. For a long time, racism was a non-topic in German mainstream discourse, both in the broader public and in mass media, but also in academic circles. This has only recently started to shift in the wake of anti-racist struggles and demonstrations and a lot of kind of knowledge production that comes from outside of the university. But at the same time, the hegemonic entrenchment of the kind of mainstream dethematization of racism has remained relatively stable, especially the kind of resistance to thinking about the systemic and structural dimension of racism. Now, this is, as I indicated, not that surprising, given that it's historically deeply rooted and kind of overdetermined by a range of factors, some of which I think are quite specific to the German context, while others can probably also occur in other contexts. In a very simplified way, I think these epistemic obstacles can be summarized as follows. First, there's a kind of temporal and geographic othering of racism. So insofar as it was part of the post-war conversation in Germany at all, it was racism that happened elsewhere in one's own past, so during National Socialism. But then the imaginary kind of hour zero, the break of 45, and the kind of refoundation of both German states, actually, so both the Federal Republic in the West and the GDR, kind of projected a clear break with that past and a kind of new identity founded on that break. Or racism was displaced into other contexts, the US, South Africa, etc., but not as something that would have a role to play in German society itself. Insofar as it was recognized as a phenomenon that also occurred in German society, and this became increasingly difficult because there were simply kind of more or less spectacular acts of racist violence that occurred, especially after the 70s. There's a kind of internal othering that occurs, a kind of outsourcing of racism to the lunatic fringe. Right-wing extremism is the primary kind of interpretive frame in social science, but also in public debates under which this has been happening. The lone perpetrators, of course, also a figure that is familiar from US discourses about racist violence, where the idea then is always, well, yeah, okay, these things happen, but it's not us. It's not the middle of society. It's these fringes, these crazy backward-looking people, or they're psychologically unstable. They get kind of duped by, you know, radicalizing forces, and then they do these things. And thirdly, insofar as people were willing to talk not only about these fringe elements, but to think of racism as a socially more broadly embedded phenomenon, it would be thematized in terms of xenophobia. And in that way, I think the kind of structural nature of racism is again dethematized by presenting it as, in the end, a psychological phenomenon, something that individuals feel in reaction to a reality where it's actually kind of understandable that they have these reactions. So, I mean, there's of course a lot of different understandings of what xenophobia exactly refers to, and in the US context, it might have slightly different connotations than in the German context. But basically, if you break it down, the idea is that, well, you know, if foreigners come and enter a community where they haven't been before, there's just this natural reaction. And it's not nice, but people kind of react to outsiders in this way. And what this does is not really explain racism, I think, but it actually masks it, and it to a certain extent reproduces it as well. All of these factors kind of converge in kind of primarily individualistic and psychologizing understanding of racism at the expense of its institutional, systemic, and structural dynamics and forms, and in sort of in the end reproducing what I started with, namely the idea that you have these discrete and kind of unconnected acts and events of violence that we should all criticize and condemn, and when they happen, people make demonstrations and, you know, candlelight vigils and so on, but they are not connected to the broader kind of structural enabling conditions against the background of which they do occur. Now, there are, of course, there have always been, in the German context now, kind of activist approaches coming out of both migrant struggles, but also kind of forms of knowledge production at the margins or outside of academia that have insisted on a more, well, structural, socio-theoretical perspective, one that understands racism as a total social phenomenon, to use a term that Etienne Balibar has used in that discussion, meaning basically as something that permeates society as a whole and cannot be confined to one particular area. And that has kind of both broad and deep roots in a society. And so you can't understand society without looking at the role and the dynamics of racism in it, and also you can't understand racism without embedding it in an understanding of the society as a whole or as a totality in the traditional Marxist vocabulary. What this clearly means is that one has to move beyond this focus on attitudes in terms of what goes into racism and kind of discrete acts of discrimination, of racist violence, as that what comes out of racism. There's a number of changes that result from this shift in perspective that Bolivar and many others have suggested. One important one that is also prominently articulated in W.E.B. Du Bois's writings is to kind of stop treating the members of racialized populations or groups as problems and understanding racism itself as a social problem, as a problem that concerns society as a whole again. Now, against this background, it's both surprising and maybe not that surprising that critical theory in the Frankfurt School tradition, so the dominant form of critical theory in context, has had almost nothing to say about the post-1945 history and persisting social reality of racism in Germany, nor did they really engage with anti-racist struggles, racist theorizing, be it in the German context or beyond. Of course, there are certain exceptions. I mean, Marcuse is probably the most obvious one. Angela Davis is an interesting figure. She has done with both with Adorno for a certain time. Critical theorists. It's usually not really discussed in this context, but we think I wrote an article on critical theory for the Frankfurt Encyclopedia, and we bring Davis in there as well because we think it's an important bridge between these different discussions that has unfortunately not really recognized. The silence is also not total because there are, as I will suggest in a moment, also important methodological and substantial implications of the early Frankfurt School's discussion of anti-Semitism for an understanding of racism today. Again, something that has not really been taken up for a variety of reasons. One of which is that it has been interested to hear whether that's also the case in the US, a kind of tendency to split off anti-Semitism and racism and really treat them as completely separate
Recording in progress.
phenomena. But yeah, as I mentioned, I mean that the tendency to treat anti-Semitism and racism as two different phenomena is a part of the explanation of why there hasn't been more, I think, discussion in that tradition, moving beyond the first generation towards the second, third generation. So figures like Habermas and Honneth. I think there's the kind of background Eurocentric narrative of modernization that you find there, which in a way mirrors some of the Eurocentrism of the earlier generation, which was a more negative one, where kind of the process of modernization as regression was also understood in a kind of Eurocentric register, and then with Honneth and Habermas, that kind of flips to a more progress-oriented narrative of modernization. Also, to a certain extent, I think let's say some form of methodological nationalism that is more obvious in Honneth, I think, in the way in which he talks about societies as more or less discrete units of analysis and moral theorizing with their own institutional orders, as if they develop kind of endogenously. This context with methodological nationalism is the assumption that we are in the end dealing with democratic societies that have a relatively homogeneous population, or at least a population for which migration and racialized domination do not really pose any kind of fundamental challenge. Just some remaining issues with marginalization that we can fix by just including these groups at the margins of the liberal democratic state into the institutional setup that we already have, and that already more or less successfully, not perfectly of course, but to a significant degree, institutionalizes the kind of values that are taken as fundamental both for these orders and for the project of critical theorizing. So it's not the case that they think that there's no need for institutional transformation, but the thought seems to be that the remaining deficits of inclusion and equality are that they are deficits of inclusion, and they can be addressed basically from within the institutional framework in a process of kind of self-correction and learning that doesn't require any kind of fundamental break with the status quo or fundamental revision of that institutional setting. And that perspective, I think, very obviously stands in direct tension with an emphasis on the structural nature of racism, because insisting on that structural nature suggests that the social relations that have been institutionalized in Western societies, on the societies of the global North, and the kinds of forms of freedom and solidarity, they realize that they are not just contingently accompanied by this or that minor exclusion of racialized groups, but that they are in a much more fundamental, historically deep, and also in a kind of continually functionally relevant way entangled with these exclusions, so that you can't just say, well, let's just include them, because that's not really possible given the setup. Again, that's a point I think that from Du Bois via Fanon to many other authors in 20th century Black radical anti-colonial thought is very common, but that resonates with some of the earlier Frankfurt School claims from a Marxist perspective about the fundamental class-dominating character of the modern state, but where that connection has really not been made. Okay, furthermore, I think it's just noteworthy that critical theorists who often take themselves to be committed to kind of taking their cue from the social struggles and movements of their day have really failed to do so with regard to quite prominent migrant and anti-racist struggles. And that's, I think, partly at least due to kind of objectivist tendencies in that tradition that retain that rhetorical commitment, but in the end actually pay very little attention to social movements and social struggles. There are many examples for that. I mean, that's already a problem, I think, for the first generation who, when in California in exile, sort of talk about the, with reason, talk about the kind of total domination in consumer society, but are totally blind to especially the race-related struggles that are happening. Again, Marcuse is then the exception. He comes to realize that this is kind of significant, but they're in general quite ignorant of that, or don't have a place for that in their own theoretical setup. So it's probably apt that one of the very few public monuments that commemorate the Frankfurt School, the Adorno Monument in Frankfurt on the university campus there, consists of a replica of Adorno's desk and a kind of labyrinth around it, and a glass cube, which I think is a almost ironic representation of the disconnect from practice. Yeah, and that's a shame, because I think Adorno's work and the work of others in that early generation of the Frankfurt School, especially the studies on anti-Semitism, fascism, anti-authoritarian personality, hold really important insights. Now, more recently, this has started to change. Some of you will know Nancy Fraser's more recent work, also in the book Cannibal Capitalism, in the lectures she gave in Berlin last year. And we had some events on racial capitalism with her, in which she sort of builds on both anti-racist struggles and earlier discussions of racial capitalism, especially in Du Bois's work, in ways that I think are very fruitful here, but also I think can be enlarged and well made more responsive, I think, to some of the struggles that I've been mentioning and that play a role here. There's also some other work which is not very well known in that tradition, especially by some colleagues who have been working at the Institute for Social Research in the 90s and 2000s, but whose work hasn't been translated, where racism is understood, and they were some of the first to also tried to push beyond xenophobia into the kind of racism vocabulary in Germany, understood as a comprehensive social relation that needs to be understood materialistically in relation to broader capitalist social formations. Again, methodologically suggesting that we can't take what are actually effects of racialization as kind of starting points for analysis or for political organizing, and maybe that's something that that is also one of the biggest differences between some of the US-based discussions and some of the European discussions without making the schism too overdrawing it. But for many in that tradition, it's very clear that, let's say, race or racial difference can in a way never be the starting point of anything, because they themselves are already the effect of historical regimes of racialization that are quite dynamic and that are also quite different across contexts, something that is reflected in the literature a lot. And finally, some of these approaches, I think, at the same time, try to take anti-racist struggles as a starting point for theorizing precisely also the structural dimension of racism, which from one perspective might seem like a source of tension, because well, the structure agency kind of problem, but it's interesting that insofar as the structural dimension of racism has at all been addressed in these discussions, at least it was as a direct outcome of kind of activists pushing the debate in that direction. So as an effect of agency, you could say structure was taken seriously. Next slide. And come to the question, well, what does insisting on the structural dimension of racism then actually mean? I'll only be able to sketch this in the talk here in the paper that this is based on. I hope that I can elaborate this in more detail in the small book that I'm writing on this. And obviously this builds on the work that many of you will be familiar with of influential thinkers in a variety of critical traditions. But I think minimally this would involve the following kind of negative claims, not surprising against the background of what I've been talking about before. So against individualization, racism is not reducible to individual prejudice, bias, ignorance, hatred, or actions. Against psychologization, racism is not reducible to mental states like prejudices, biases, and attitudes. All of these play a role and have their space, but when they are taken to be foundational, when they become the exclusive focus of an analysis of racism, as it still often happens, then that's really problematic. Against othering, pathologization or externalization, racism is not reducible to a fringe phenomenon, disorders, or what lone perpetrators are doing. And also against, it's the kind of materialism part, against idealization. So racism is not just a kind of set of beliefs, ideas, or dogmas. And I mean, that's, yeah, so that's on a kind of general level, some of the negative claims that I think follow from this shift to the structural. And then I think it's useful to maybe separate, let's say, three dimensions in which the structural nature of racism can and should be spelled out in more detail, partly because I think it remains under-theorized in all of these dimensions. Again, this is nothing very original and built on the work of many others. So in the dimension of social ontology or social theory, I think the structural is meant to indicate that there's something relatively permanent or stable or inert that at the same time can manifest itself in different ways, in different contexts. Sadly, Hessinger has recently made this distinction between structural and the structure and the systemic. So the structural refers to the more kind of abstract layer of analysis, and then the systemic would be particular systems in which these structures are instantiated, and they can play out in quite different ways, let's say different political contexts and so on. What the structural in that dimension also indicates is that there's a relative independence from individual intentions and actions, especially the intentions of actions and actions of those who are present here and now in a particular context interacting. So it's about the ways in which these are embedded in relations. I mean, I also had to think of your early book on Marxist social ontology, where you push back against this kind of individualist social ontology towards a more relational model. I think that's part of the motivation in these debates as well, to come up with a relational analysis, let's say. I think the relational and the structural are closely related here of how racism is embedded in these social contexts. Well, there are all these discussions that one would have then to look at in more detail about the ways in which then also structure the space of possibilities, provide differential access to members of racialized groups to different social goods, and also, and I think that's from a democratic theory perspective, I think maybe the most important aspect here, provide differential access to the control that groups can exercise over how these forms of structural inequality are represented, how they can be challenged, and how they are can be changed. The second dimension is methodological and would involve an analysis of structural explanations. In a way, again, the concept of structural explanation is first something of a placeholder, I think. So it's about, let's say, questions that you don't get into view if you focus primarily on kind of more individualist explanations or belief-centered explanations. So the classical question where structural explanations come in the case of racism is to explain the persistence of racialized inequalities, given that there is something of a long-term decline in openly racist attitudes. Of course, it's not stable and not kind of unilinear, but still. And given the kind of relative legal institutionalization of formal equality in many societies where these racialized inequalities still persist, and in some cases even get worse. And so, in a way, in such a situation, there are not that many options, let's say, that you have to explain this. I mean, one is basically a kind of explanation that just blames the victims in a way and says, well, it's their own fault or it's their culture's fault, and it gets uncoupled from the kind of broader social structural background that's operative here. Again, Hessinger's work, I think, provides some interesting starting points for spelling this out in terms of structural constraints that explain why individuals make certain decisions, or at least more likely to make certain decisions, depending on their role or situation in these broader structures relating to what she calls the sociality of meaning. So how different the racialized groups and individuals are situated in the broader social and cultural context, and of course also the kind of material access to resources, etc. That is important here, and where certain resources such as education have a kind of multiplicatory effect, or the exclusion that is reproduced through them multiplies into different areas. And finally, the structural is also relevant for the political perspective, because it shifts the horizon from one of, let's say, integration or inclusion or recognition to one of a transformation that is structural or systemic, and that has become more relevant as such in more recent anti-racist social movement and struggles. So the taken together, I think these dimensions sort of suggest also the complexity of the notion of structural racism. I think they do have clear resonances with certain methodological and substantial claims at the core of the early Frankfurt School's analysis of anti-Semitism, which have involved a similar kind of rejection of individualistic and psychologizing approaches. Although they were interested in prejudice, it was prejudice always as something that is embedded in and that is functional for broader social processes. They have also insisted that you cannot explain anti-Semitism by looking at Jews, but you have to look at the anti-Semites in a way which suggests that anti-Semitic and other racist or racist practices and beliefs are actually quite independent from whatever they purport to be about, or from the objects of their beliefs, attitudes, and practices. And therefore, that's something that Adorno formulates very clearly. It's already a bad idea if you try to challenge them on the basis of empirical Jews are not really like that, or how can you say something like that when you have Jewish friends, etc., etc. So that just doesn't get the dynamic of these phenomena correctly. Also, I thought there's a really interesting resonance between Fanon and Adorno here. Not just do they both, I think even in the same year, start thinking about cultural racism as a way in which racism evolves after 1945 and in the kind of anti-colonial or post-colonial moment, in different ways, of course, but Adorno notices that in interviews with qualitative studies, basically with Germans, and he's like, well, they're not openly Nazis anymore, but there's kind of cultural metamorphosis of their racism that suddenly becomes a civilizational kind of discourse about the other and about having to defend white Europe, etc. And Fanon, of course, has a similar claim in the mid-50s. And both of them, I think, also really interestingly similar ways insist that, again, racism has to be understood as a kind of part of the whole, and it cannot be just understood as something that you can either add or just subtract without having a more holistic understanding of how it's embedded in that whole and sort of permeates society as a whole. Yeah, so in conclusion, not to take too much time, I'll just very briefly talk about one particular example for how such a more structural understanding of racism can highlight how racism also structures more concrete interactions, practices, discourses, etc. And the example I want to briefly talk about is well, one of the many racist terror attacks that have happened in Germany over the last decades. The attack in Hanau, it's a city not far from Frankfurt in Hessen, in 2020. And on the occasion of the first anniversary of that attack, it was quite interesting to see the kind of split between the official commemoration, where the government and politicians deplored a kind of an attack on all of us and pointed out that right-wing extremism and this lunatics like this gunman, that they are a threat to democracy and so on, while the initiative in which the families and friends and some of the victims who survived were organized basically highlighted all the failures that have led both to the attack itself, the completely inadequate response to the attack by the authorities, and the kind of aftermath, both in the kind of public discourse, but also in the ways in which the authorities then try to deal with their own failings on the event, during the event. And they made it very clear that all these failures can only be understood in their own words as well, by reference to something like structural racism. And with that, they very clearly wanted to push back against this kind of exceptionalization and individualization that I was talking about before. It's also a clear example, I think, of what Melina and others have characterized as kind of epistemic activism, maybe even in a somewhat more elaborate form, because it really involves kind of counter investigations they did together with kind of non-mainstream journalists and artists, etc., to reconstruct what was happening and to actually bring into view the enabling conditions for these forms of racist violence that are then appearing as these discrete acts that we all have to condemn without addressing the kind of broader failures that are in the background and that fundamentally involve a failure to understand how racism operates in the first in the first place. There are many other examples for the way in which I think that kind of racism that Alisa Bierria has recently described as structural racism within reason or within public reason operates and has shaped the German public debate, but also other public debates, and also the lived reality of racialized populations in the recent past. So I just want to draw these connections because it's not just about how there's a kind of response to these clear acts of racist violence, but in the same step almost as condemning these discrete acts of racist violence, which everyone was on board with. The Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, whom you see on the Spiegel cover here, calling for deportations, or Bild Zeitung, the biggest tabloid in Germany, which of course is against Nazis and racist violence, but has no problem kind of producing and reproducing the kind of broader racist framings that are in the background here, and that the initiative, amongst others, have identified and decried as enabling conditions for these discrete acts of violence. There's a lot of examples one could talk about here. More recently, and especially after October 7, the discourse of imported anti-Semitism provides, I think, an important and relevant example, especially since, well, in Germany, which is the nation of perpetrators and bystanders, anti-Semitism is now broadly understood primarily as something that we Germans have successfully overcome. And now that we've overcome it, we have to identify it in those populations who now represent it, which is primarily the kind of Arab and Muslim migrant communities. And the whole thinking behind this notion of imported anti-Semitism is that they brought it with them into our already kind of fully denazified and non-anti-Semitic society, which is kind of a shocking delusion, because the overwhelming majority of anti-Semitic hate crimes are committed by far-right and white supremacist neo-Nazis, while that whole discourse suggests as if the real threat is from these communities. And that's also where most of the money in kind of prevention programs goes to, if you look at those government programs. Yeah, and then of course these framings have provided a cover for precisely the kind of anti-migrant, anti-refugee discourse and policy that Scholz, the Chancellor, and big newspapers like the Bild Zeitung are kind of putting forward under the cover of fighting anti-Semitism. Okay, at the same time, I think the initiative and other anti-racist struggles and organizations have also a kind of more maybe hopeful side to them. So they don't only show that there is really this kind of structural layer that seems to be very hard to dislodge, but they also show the possibility of, well, kind of developing anti-racist counter discourses and counter practices that are also examples of kind of transversal solidarity across lines of division, let's say, that are kind of produced and reproduced also from above. Although of course they're not without their own conflicts. And I think what they in the end show is that racism is, or structural racism is fundamentally a kind of ambivalent phenomenon that is both very much tied to stabilization and reproduction of social domination, but also a kind of dynamic phenomenon that is also changing in response to anti-racist struggles. And so fundamentally, it's both a kind of total social fact and a fragmented totality that is traversed by contradictions and struggles. And this banner, as you see from one of the Hanau demonstrations here, in a way nicely captures this ambivalence, because it addresses Germany or German society as a whole as the lone perpetrator. So it takes this idea of the lone perpetrator, the Einzeltäter, and says, well, that is society essentially. And I think, yeah, well, I just thought it captures this kind of ambivalence that I wanted to highlight. And I'll just end here. I hope it wasn't too long. It was a bit too long.
Oh, no,
And
it's
look
great.
forward to the
Perfect.
discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a very quick question. I get that xenophobia, like the way it's constructed and the way it's talked about, is often very like pathologizing or psychological, but couldn't sort of a structural account of xenophobia be really helpful in accounts of race, or even accounts of like how different races are treated differently? Like I think in your example about how Muslim immigrants are blamed for anti-Semitism in Germany, that's kind of an instance where you see like structural xenophobia being one way in which Muslim people in Germany are treated differently than Jewish people in Germany, for example. So yeah, I just was wondering about sort of whether we can structurify xenophobia too, just like we're structurifying race.
Yeah, thank you. So that would there would definitely be some progress, but my problems with the term are really going deeper. And of course, we could just say, well, we just redefine the term in a way that has nothing to do with the meaning of its component parts, and then let's just use it that way. But I'm not sure that would work. I mean, so my problem is that, xenophobia suggests that whether it's more structural or more individual, this is primarily about the reactions of psychological aversion to the foreigner. That's the literal meaning, right? And this is well, for a variety of reasons problematic, because first, it's not really about psychological reactions in the end, as I would understand it. Second, these reactions, although they play a role, they are not really comparable to other phobias. So, arachnophobia or something like that, where good to be worried about some spiders, and you just shouldn't have too much worry about it. So, then if you think about along these lines, it would suggest that, well, there's reason to worry about foreigners. You just shouldn't exaggerate it, basically, and that's a kind of very problematic, I think, implication. And also, my bigger worry is that the whole term repeats the racist othering that it apparently seeks to designate, because you make the object of racial hatred into a foreigner, into someone who actually doesn't really belong, and or who's perceived as not belonging, but who's then also described again as xenos, as a foreigner, someone who's not really part of that we. And that's problematic again for a variety of reasons, because well, of this othering of people independently of their actual status or history or sense of belonging themselves. So it's very independent from whether they are born in that country, whether they speak the language, whether they have, whether they're documented or not, whether they socially belong or not. It has more to do with racializing features, names, projections, and so on that, and it also cancels out that unevenness of how foreigners are treated, right? So an unevenness that Du Bois, among others, has described by saying, well, he never felt as free as when he was in Europe, like yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it wasn't the same experience for many others who were in Europe at the time and racialized in different ways. So yeah, and then I think, if you would say, well, okay, but we should still make certain differences between different groups that are racialized in different ways. On the one hand, I agree with you there, but then I'm worried that if you say, well, we have two clear categories, let's say racism on the one hand and xenophobia on the other hand, you in a way presuppose what I think would again need to be explained, namely that there are these different groups and that they have, they are not naturally given, but they are themselves the outcome of racialization. So that's an interesting thing that I only noticed when I started to talk to people in the US about that term xenophobia, where some colleagues I work with who work on Latinx political philosophy and so on, and racism, suggested that actually a lot of Latinx people think that xenophobia might be the right term because they don't think of themselves as a race, right? Whereas with anti-black racism, no one would ever think of speaking of xenophobia because of it's a very. And on the one hand, I get that, and I think it's an important difference that this distinction tries to track. But at the same time, it just strikes me as problematic to assume that, well, we just have a race and then we have an ethnic group or a pan-ethnic group or something completely different. I don't think you can presume that. I think, Hall and many others have shown that the presumably more objective categories of ethnic group are just as much in a way the outcome of racialization processes are as the racial categories that. Or the other thing that I, just sort of found, I mean, we talked about this a bit over lunch, in that, like in the US, even after 9/11, Arab, Palestinian, Muslim people are, they're Caucasian. So in a way, they are not really a part of, and officially they don't really, I mean, it's just interesting, right? Whereas in Europe, it would be obvious to any critical scholar of race that that's kind of a weird, very weird way of thinking about these populations. So those are some of the reasons why I think, why I would rather ditch the term and think of this as racism in different formations, of course, and with different dynamics and histories.
Okay, next we have Dan, and then I'll move to the more established people.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question's about domination. It seems like critical theory's idea of domination is just sort of waiting to be applied, right, to this racial problem. And so one question is just sort of, what works would you recommend on racial domination, if there are any? And then what do you see as future directions for research or theoretical work on that topic?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and one on which I might have to get back to you after thinking more about it. I mean, the text that comes to mind that is most clearly making that connection, let's say, is Stuart Hall's Race, Articulation, and Society Structured in Dominance, I think it's called, where he wants to come up both with an account of racial domination as, well, an account of racial domination as being part of a broader understanding of social domination, and especially, and also of capitalist domination, let's say. And then, Hall being Hall, this doesn't really get developed in the most systematic ways, but there's a lot of very interesting thoughts, I think, in this paper and some of the other papers from that phase, when he's still more Marxist than a few years later, when he's becomes more and more interested in the discursive and the representational, which, not to downplay it, but which just has a different focus than in this work than in this earlier time, where he's very much interested in the ideas of totality and how thinking about social domination requires both going beyond individualist and interactionist accounts of domination, and requires to see racial domination as, and he discusses the case of South Africa and tries to show that even there, in an apartheid regime, racial domination can really only be properly understood if you see it as part of the broader social context of domination, including capitalist domination, domination of labor power, etc., etc. So that would be one way in which I think, one could look there. And then the other thing that I think would require, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that would require more work and more thought, but one of the things I'm interested in is the relation between, let's say, more openly repressive or material forms of domination and more ideological ones. And, well, how we can understand those as structural, while at the same time leaving space for resistance and the kinds of agency that develop under these conditions. I mean, but again, these are, Siri and many others have worked on these issues for a long time, and I think all these discussions are relevant to understanding also specifically racist or racial domination. And the Frankfurt School, I think, in the early generation has been much better at looking at domination as this kind of more abstract process, let's say. And I think they have neglected a bit the concrete ways in which that process manifests itself for, even let's say within the factory or so, and where then, and Marxist is very much in view, where then there's another dynamic between the agents, the workers, and their ways of doing things, and the domination they are confronted with. So you would at least have to look at these two sides or two levels, I think, in both of these, in all of these cases.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Let me go, including my own, but let me go to my colleague Linda Elkoff, who's on Zoom, if you can hear me. And unmute yourself, Linda.
Hi, Robin. That was a terrific paper. I haven't seen anybody else sort of put it all together like you did. It was really wonderful. And I think you're right that the concept, we still need more to do to really clarify, define, precisify, But the only question I had was I was concerned a little bit that colonialism wasn't a major part of the analysis. You talk about capitalism, and that needs to be there, but colonialism started the whole ball rolling. And if we think about the transnational system of resource extraction, which is capitalist, but embedded within this long colonial history, you get a sense of structure that's global. And I think racism works to it has a legitimating role, ideologically, discursively. It legitimates the global world order, Western dominance, and the global transnational flows of material resources. And so, I think I would go, use Gramsci here. I know he's not a critical theorist, but Gramsci's, talking about constructing hegemony. How do you construct hegemony around the global world order, both politically and materially? You do it through this racism. So I was just a little worried that that piece of the puzzle was left out. And I think what that shows is that an anti-racist movement and an anti-racist opposition to that ideology is really challenging the entire world order. That's what it's challenging. And so you can't solve this problem at the level of the nation state. You really are challenging the Western dominance. So I think it's got to be part, you've got a lot in there, but add this. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Linda. And you're right that this is a gap, and one that I should try to address, and just it's a very daunting task, and you laid out the stakes very, very clearly. Maybe just a few thoughts. I mean, so one is that I think this is partly due to my focus on the German discussion, but even there, I think you're right that it should be part of the of how I characterize it, because that was also part of the whole kind of inability to thematize racism, that Germany understood itself counterfactually, of course, in contrast to the UK or to France or to the Netherlands, as not a colonial, not a colonial empire, despite its obvious history of colonialism, and then thought that, well, that's why we also don't have significant Black populations, because we didn't have colonies, we didn't have migration from the colonies as in France or the UK, and that's also why we don't really have a race problem. Which then had these two sides, namely both the invisibilization of the presence of Black people in Germany, which is longstanding, of its own colonial history, which to this day is not acknowledged in the way in which the Holocaust is, and also the juxtaposition of the migrants that Germany had as not really qualifying as racialized populations, because racialized populations, again, that's what the others had, those with colonial histories, right? So yeah, I agree that that is a part of it and should be thematized. At the same time, I think we would have to a certain extent, maybe stretch the concept to really do the work for the current constellation, because I mean, I totally agree with you, of course, in terms of, Western dominance, resource extraction, etc. But one would have to be very precise in analyzing the way in which, for example, labor power through migration is moving around the globe in, as a form of neo-colonial extraction, which on the one hand, I think one can do, but it's not as, but at least I think it needs more, both conceptual and analytical work to make that claim. But yeah, I think, Du Bois has important things to say about that, and also linking the kind of anti-racist struggle with the broader anti-colonial struggle in an attempt to construct some kind of hegemony, as you say. So yeah, I have to think more about this, but it's a very good and challenging
Good,
question.
so we can get more questions in. First, Leah, the order in which I saw.
Thank you so much here at the back. So thank you for the great presentation. I love very much how you talk about racism and at the same time connecting with xenophobia, migration studies, anti-Semitism. So I wanted to ask you if you think that the wave of authoritarianism and nationalism that we have had in the last decade has contributed to a rise in racism. And also, I feel that at some point, maybe we can say general things, but at the same time, we have to become particular on certain types of society. And I feel that because you are from Germany, I think it can be very good for us to that you can tell us how you perceive American society. Certain structural factors or power dynamics or the way certain institutions work or function that are perpetuating some structural racism, because you have talked about education, politics, so maybe you consider that some policy reform or it should be needed. So that's, thank you so much. And I will talk more in the, after the colloquium.
Great, thank you. I mean, that's also very important and also broad question. So let me just start with the first aspect, the rise of kind of authoritarianism and how it's connected to racism. So I think the connection is extremely strong, right? And I mean, I think that it's in some ways obvious. I mean, if you look at the rhetoric of many of the authoritarian leaders and parties, etc. And I think in the end, the kind of, let's say, ethno-nationalism that drives a lot of these discourses is then the conceptual link between this authoritarianism and the blatant racism that it involves. I mean, and it also, I think, is again something that shows how different types of racism and also racism and anti-Semitism are kind of merging, where the kind of discourse of the great replacement has become the trope for the transnational kind of far right, and at the same time manages to activate and latch onto seemingly broadly shared fears in society of well, some kind of loss of privilege or loss of power, I guess. That, I mean, that's a point that Adorno makes, and I think that again is extremely important and actually would mean that we have to be very careful how we speak then here. So Adorno says in the 50s, when he notices this phenomenon already, he says, well, in most cases, this is just a phantasmatic and anticipatory loss of privilege, basically, that drives people to turn to kind of authoritarian neo-fascist programs. So it's actually not the worst off, and it's not those who don't have access to social privilege that drive a lot of these movements. And the same has been shown, I think, for Brexit and for, in part at least, for the Trump electorate. But it's in many cases, or empirically significant extent, kind of middle class anticipation or phantasma of, well, they're coming for us, basically, that drives this. And so, and that gets articulated in both a racist and classist way. So it's kind of fused, very intimately fused together. But yeah, so then one would have to look at the details. You're right, and kind of see how this plays out in other contexts. You know, I don't know, Argentina and so on. With regard to the second question, I mean, just so I think most of the manifestations of structural racism are not that different in the end between the US and you know, most European countries. They are just more extreme to a certain extent and more visible. And well, you know, if you visit, strike you as more visible, I guess. And that's, you know, especially in terms of urban segregation, I think it's definitely more extreme. But at the same time, you know, if you go to Paris and to a certain extent also Berlin and other German cities, there's also clear patterns of segregation. And I think last point, what, you know, because you asked, well, then what, you know, what is it that one could do against that? And I think there's the notion of kind of public and publicly accessible infrastructure in the kind of core areas of social life or social reproduction. So education, housing, health, and work, but also transportation and so on. That would be one obvious, you know, the pandemic has shown that, you know, societies that had that were better able to deal with that, and societies who didn't have that or where access to infrastructure is extremely limited. This directly translated into, you know, death and sickness for people in these communities. So
Okay, you have a lot of questioners. Thoroughness is a virtue, however, but you know, maybe moderated a little. Because I have like about 5 people. So Patricia and then Serene, and then me. Patiently waiting.
I'll try to make it fast. Thank you so much, Robin, for the talk. I found it super interesting, and my question relates to Linda's and the use of totality in your paper. It's a concept that I've been thinking about a lot, and so I'm just wondering, you know, the way that you're thinking about it, because on the one hand, there have been people, including within the decolonial literature, who oppose the use of that term totality as it's used within the Frankfurt School, because it's totalizing and it sort of universalizes the perspective of Western capitalist societies onto the rest of the world. On the other hand, it's a really useful concept because it captures the social whole, as you very well mentioned in your paper, and it gets used really productively. And I think it's really awesome to use that term to explain structural racism precisely because of the global nature of the world order and its colonial history. But I do think that it's very important to clarify those different meanings of totality and deal with the ideological function that it plays in critical theory. So I just wanted to invite you to share more about that term, and if you have thoughts about how, and actually like using it in terms of structural racism can help us untangle and disentangle and realize that it's a differentiated totality and not one that is homogeneous globally, like capitalism.
yeah, thanks. No, that's very helpful. And I mean, it's definitely, I mean, so I have actually quite significant reservations with regard to the notion of totality, in part for the reasons that you mentioned, but also because I think it, you know, even if you bracket for the moment the question of universalizing a certain pattern of social development in Western capitalist societies, it just suggests a kind of homogeneity of the social order, and that it's driven by one, you know, identifiable logic or held together by such a logic that is problematic for a variety of reasons, and that also, I think, tends to underestimate both the kind of fragmented and differentiated nature of the totality that you mentioned, but also the role of not just, I mean, contradictions, but really, you know, social struggles and movements, etc., that resist totalization to a certain extent, or that also resist an analysis in terms of totalization, and that I think, you know, the use of the notion of totality in some of the early work of the Frankfurt School therefore had as a non-contingent byproduct precisely the ignorance of such movements, because it just didn't, they, in a way, couldn't come into view if you already started an analysis of totality in terms of that logic that they had identified. So yeah, that would be my answer. That yeah, totality in the sense of something that the analysis has to keep in view, let's say, and try to relate the different phenomena to, but not in the sense of a, let's say, starting point or something that would represent a kind of closed or unifying perspective. Yeah, but I'll try to make that clear and kind of take up the concern that you have. I think that's a good concern. Yeah.
Okay, Serene?
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. I loved this talk. A quick comment about colonialism and then a question on a different tack. Just the comment about colonialism is that I think it's possibly very important for relating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism to each other. I think a lot about this comment that gets repeated a lot in decolonial theory, that 1492 is this important year, not just because it's the date of the colonization of the Americas, but because it's the year of the accomplishment of the Reconquista, and that the Jews and the Moors are both expelled from Spain. So just throwing that out there. But my question is on a different tack, which is that I think when people talk about structural racism, they tend to have two different contrasts in mind. Like, one is a contrast with individual accounts of racism, which I think you really brought up in your talk. But the other one is like just a contrast with ideal, or like not ideal is in the Marxist sense, right? Like non-material accounts of racism. So I was just and it seems clear that like the very material account of structural racism is extremely good for explaining the situation of African Americans. You know, if we're talking about things like residential segregation, mass incarceration, things like that. But like when you are kind of suggesting that we want a more structural account of racism, like, do you mean that includes the other forms that you were talking about? Do you mean to also imply that it should be more material than cultural? And if so, do you think like a more material analysis works for the kinds of cases that you're interested in?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that would be the I think the direction I would try to develop this in. Although I think that let's say, speaking of cultural racism, is not necessarily the same as having an idealized list or an ideal-centered understanding of racism, because again, like Paul and many others have you know, shown in the relevant sense the cultural racism manifests itself very materially, right? And in ways that are not reducible, let's say, to questions of representation or such. So yeah, so I would definitely see an important role for cultural racism here, especially if you want to show how racism has transformed itself beyond, let's say, the more classical biologistic racialism that many people still think must be at the core of it. And I think that neglects also the way in which the cultural and the biological have been intertwined from the very beginning. And that goes back to Spain and the kind of limpieza de sangre thing was never just about biology and so on. So I think it's complex from the get-go. But yeah, so that's a very important point. I have to think more about that. I mean, the other contrast where I thought you might also be going when you said it's not just against individual racism that the structure is kind of positioned is, I mean, sort of these other layers, let's say. So institutional racism, for example, which again is an important aspect, I think. But if you think, for example, against racial profiling or police racism, it seems clear to me that neither the individual nor the cultural nor the institutional really get at the way in which this actually works in a way. So also there, I think you have to, and if you look at Carmichael and Hamilton, and their book, they said institutional racism, but what they were really talking about was structural racism, I think. And so that's, I think, where I would push back. And the first comment, I just take that on board, and yeah, I have to think look more into that.
Well, you just answered one of my two questions, which sort of. So yeah, thank you for this very comprehensive introduction to the theme and some very big insights that I hope you'll develop further. So my first question was, well, it was going to be the same, but what I wanted to ask was about the separation that seems to be intrinsic to this, a lot of the analyses of structure, of structural from institutional. And I think that is problematic in some cases, in the sense that I think you need to talk about institutionally mediated structures at least, because it partly comes from the sort of the Marxist background in a certain way, that law and politics are, superstructural or something. Unfortunately, they have real life consequences, especially in the case of racism, with the way that, and in complex ways, I think, that really would be helpful to articulate. And that's not to say that there isn't structure, which is, so the idea of structure, is promoted in terms of a reproduction of social practices. And it comes essentially from the sociological context, to some degree political sociology, so that gets better. But I do think for specifically, especially with regard to capitalism and the application of structural racism, structured injustice to capitalism, the institutional framework even there is extremely important in terms of, laws of property and the relation to state power. And likewise, I think there are elements of that specifically in the analysis of structural racism, obviously the incarceration thing, but also all the way that law is used and the way that state power is still used to push it along in various ways. So that was my first comment. So that's just for further analysis. But the other interaction that I wanted to call attention to, I think you're right that it's good to focus, and I started writing this stuff about structural injustice just generally, and then I saw that really the cases are somewhat different with gender and with race and with capitalism, which are the three main ways that it's used, although it has other implications. So it is good to focus on structural racism, but there are also important interactions between them. And I'm wondering how you would explain specifically the fact that a lot of these authoritarian movements are distinctively patriarchal as well as racist. I mean, that seems to be an inherent characteristic of them, which suggests a tremendous, even though I don't like the term intersectional, but it does suggest an intersection, in this case anyway, between race and gender interacting in very negative ways to enhance each other, or even maybe they have a same root. So I was wondering if you have any explanation, because that is a big question in my mind. Why are they so noteworthy? They're noteworthy for their women, the traditionalist attitude to women back in the home, and even where women aren't involved in supporting it, or even in some cases as titular rulers like Evita Peron or something, Eva Peron. Do you have any explanation? And I would just suggest, I'm talking too long, sorry, but I would suggest that this would be a theme, even though it's good to focus. I don't see the interaction between, and you claim it to be materialist. Obviously, capital uses both of those dimensions in ways that some people have tried to articulate, gender and race, but especially the gender thing for authoritarian, xenophobic, whatever we call it, racist movements. It's striking.
Thank you, Carol. These are great points. Let me just, well, the first one, I just confirm that I agree that the institutional mediation is extremely important, and that both formal and informal institutions, I would think, play an important role there. So yes, law and the state, but also, less formalized institutions. I don't know, like the family, for example, are extremely important there. Yeah. Then about the second question. Yes, I mean, so two thoughts. I mean, so the observation is entirely correct, obviously, and it's striking. I mean, one explanation I've seen, which I thought was convincing, but I'm not an expert in these movements, is that in many cases they appeal to a kind of sense of a natural order of society in which both racial homogeneity and an untroubled gender order and gender division of labor is considered to be not just what we had, but in a way what had its good sense and worked for everyone and was kind of in a way the natural order of things. And I think that this kind of naturalization of social hierarchies and the benefits, material benefits and symbolic benefits that they generate for parts of the population plays an important role there, and that therefore kind of appealing to this both sense of privilege and the perceived loss of that privilege can play out in both of these directions and can be combined, right? So that it becomes an attractive framing for, especially for men and also for young men, but also for some women to think of it in that way. So it's although there are some women obviously who support these movements, there's a real split in the demographics. I mean, I don't know the numbers only for Europe, but it's very, very clear that
it's small.
yeah, it's very
It's
clear
almost
that
all
yeah,
especially the violent.
yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so that would be one way to go, but I think it's complex, and I would have to think or read more about that. The other thing I wanted to say with regard to capitalism, I mean, so there I think the function is at least twofold. I mean, on the one hand, you have the kind of material role that, and this can be spelled out both for gender and for race, of course, that certain forms of domination and exploitation have played and continue to play in labor regimes, for example, and where the provision of cheap exploitable labor or labor that is not categorized as labor even plays a very foundational role for the functioning of capitalist societies. And this includes the well-documented fact that like irregular migrant labor is constitutive for the function of key sectors, construction, agriculture, care, and so on.
Mhm.
And then on the more ideological level, I think there are these mechanisms that again already Du Bois talked about, of kind of splitting the working
Interfering with
class,
solidarity of the working
and
class.
suggesting that you can side with your bosses because they belong to the same racial group, and this will get you both material and symbolic benefits that you can sort of rely on. And then I think this still plays an important role, although some have argued that the material benefits of that have considerably shrunk, let's say, for parts of the white working class at least, which might open up new ways of, or new possibilities of solidarity. I don't know, but yeah, so that would be.
Go on. We're listening.
Hello, everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yep.
Yeah, my name is Lilian. I'm a PhD student in critical theory at Loyola University Chicago. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us. I look forward to the book. My question is less clarificatory and more about the possibilities of where we could go forward with critical theory. And this speaks a little bit to, I think it was Patricia's question. Could you speak to the possibility of developing less universal critical theory for which attempts to address a universal structural racism? As you've said, it emerges in different forms from place to place, and it interacts with different other power structures too. My go-to example is always caste in India. Sorry. And perhaps it deserves a more specific critical theory and praxis. My offering is that perhaps a transnational approach, to address Professor Alkoff's question as well, might better serve the various forms that capitalism, racism, and other forms of oppression take in different communities, while also allowing for cross-cultural solidarity, which is what we want with this overarching kind of a thing. And this insight is also from an earlier CUNY talk that Sayla Ben-Habib did in February last year. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a very, very important challenge. I mean, so my tendency would be to say that in a way both would be desiderata, right? To have the context specificity and I mean that's why I focused on the German context to a certain extent, simply because I thought that it's important for understanding why critical theory has done certain things and hasn't done other things, and also, I mean, why Germany is such a weird place in many ways, also still today. But I, at the same time, think that this specificity also needs to be connected in these more overarching, patterns and interrelations and structures. And I mean, there is simply a lot of, let's say, circulation there, both in terms of the and international interconnections. Obviously, I mean, the whole point that Linda made about colonialism points in that direction. But also, if you look at the kind of ideologies of the contemporary moment and the kind of the Great Replacement theory is one of the big. It's not necessarily global, that's true. And, it doesn't work in the same way in all kinds of contexts, but at least in large parts of the global north, it has emerged as a kind of key ideological element of, the resurgence of racism. And so beyond the specificity of context, these are connections that I think are very important. And then the question, I think, in terms of the way in which this maps onto the kind of global nature of capitalism makes it even more complicated. But yeah, I don't really have a better answer to your question at the moment, I'm afraid, and we'll have to work more on it.
Yeah, let's take both questions very quickly.
Yeah.
First, Susan, then Jeff.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you, Robin, so much. I'm excited about this work. I think it's really great. And I agree with Linda. I think the way that it's been put together is unique in like sort of the presentation of ideas. I wanted to ask, and I think maybe this is like a different part of the project, about the audience of this argument and also sort of the normative aspects of the argument. So wherein I take this to be a critique of individualized kind of like social epistemological arguments around race or ethics around racism in philosophy or in like theory in general. But some of the problems that you motivated in the beginning, that is people's anxiety to discuss racism because of its individualizing dynamic, I wanted to see how they're addressed in the structural account and how one can feel like they have responsibilities inside of anti-racist struggles. One of the benefits of intersectionality is the dynamic that liberation is like intersecting in that, like, because these oppressions interlock, you have a mutual fight for liberation. And I want to see how I'm curious how that normativity comes out in sort of the because I agree, structural racism has the right explanatory power. And I want to see what the normative upshot, like, or what kind of the idea of how to recapture that individual conception of responsibility would be.
Yeah.
And
Oh, thanks. Okay, it's a great paper. I'll try to be brief. Of course, I'm sympathetic with the analysis of structural racism, and one of the key moves is to say it's not about psychological attitudes. But I also wonder if there's a danger of going too far in the direction of, one of the virtues of the Frankfurt School is trying to combine materialist social theory, cultural analysis, and some form of, psychological analysis. Whether it could be, psychoanalysis as a theory that bridges the individual and society, but also like the authoritarian personality, like doing empirical research on people's, attitudes and things. So I just wonder if, and a lot of this is implicit in what you say about how ideology functions, but I just wonder if there's something worth thematizing about what the Frankfurt School does with psychology. And then the one place I wonder where it's really relevant to this paper is if you're talking about those obstacles to talking about structural racism. I mean, has anybody really, I guess, I don't know all the literature on structural racism that well, has anybody really done a really good diagnosis of that resistance in particular context? I'm thinking of sort of, in the classic account of Charles Mills, the period of what de facto white supremacy, the resistance to, and the psychology that goes along with resisting actually even seeing and understanding structural racism. But I wonder if there could be further psychological analysis, maybe even empirical research, maybe there has been, but anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Never related to them. Good.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
have
the
to
really-
be,
yeah.
I have to be
Didn't know
brief,
three.
although these are huge questions.
Big oppression.
So.
You have to come back.
I'm excited to be here. Miranda, this is really a big question, and it's an important concern. One way, I always think of the structural having the advantage that it's precisely not about the individual's failings to do this or that, but rather the appeal that as a society or as a collective, we have to address this challenge, which then still means, of course, that given the resources and experiences and whatever it is that differentiates people, that there will be different distributions of responsibility and what they can be expected to do, etc.
Right.
But I think the primary move being to say that, well, this is a social structural problem. It's not primarily, at least, or in the first instance, about what did you do wrong and what can you do to fix that, but rather, well, what can we do different, kind of in a more forward-looking register, organizing society differently, so that this past doesn't just continue or get worse. Again, I don't think that means that all responsibilities are the same, or that we can expect the same from everyone. I think it's still true that, normatively speaking, there will be differences here, also depending on what it takes to go forward. But that's at least the starting point. Okay, then we'll have to talk more about the details of that. Yeah, Jeff. So on the one hand, I think yes, as a methodological paradigm, this is still inspiring and the way to go. But at the same time, I'm also not sure if all of the elements of the substantial analysis would necessarily still provide the best way of thinking about it, because they are to a certain extent also just very much tied to that moment and to that particular socio-historic place of Europe as well, and all the ideas about the decline of the family and the father figure, and don't necessarily want to go there, I guess today. But then on the other hand, the things that especially Adorno again has to say about guilt and projection and kind of defense mechanisms in and their role in anti-Semitism, I think is quite instructive for understanding parts of these resistance mechanisms that still operate today, and which they don't mirror one-to-one, I think, and there's a specific structure, I think, to anti-Semitism that critical theory focuses on that is also not replicated necessarily in the same way, but still you can find a lot of kind of functional equivalents or things that are quite similar in the way in which they operate. Mill's work on white ignorance, I think, is very helpful there. More material, maybe, and more concrete in its analysis would, so Gloria Wecker, she's a Dutch Afro-Caribbean social theorist. She wrote this book, White Innocence, which is about the Netherlands' inability to deal with racism, because it, again, is a bit similar to Germany, but also differently imagined itself to be the most tolerant liberal country on earth. And so any thematization of racism was thought to be an attack on that, deserved distinction. And White Innocence, for her, marks this reaction, which is a very interesting mix between, defensiveness and aggressiveness, which I think we also know from other contexts in which, racism gets thematized and then triggers these reactions. It's not a quantitative empirical study, but it's a very interesting qualitative study, I think, of those mechanisms in that particular context. And then we would have to look, I think, at you know, in other contexts.
Okay.
Yeah.
The rest of you left for a little bit of a reception afterwards. Please join me in thanking Robin.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Thank you.